"Get out of my house. You have 30 minutes." Ethan Reynolds said it without even looking up from his phone. 12 years of marriage, and he couldn't give her 30 seconds of eye contact. He actually snapped his fingers, and two security guards appeared in the doorway of the bedroom where Emily was still sitting on the edge of the bed, unable to move, unable to breathe. He had already changed the alarm codes, already had her credit cards frozen, already erased her name from the company database. He had planned this removal the way he planned acquisitions, efficiently, completely, without mercy. Drop your city below. Let's see how far Emily's story travels. If you've ever been underestimated by someone, you gave everything to stay with me. Because this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't you dare leave before the ending, because what Emily did next will change the way you think about starting over. The rain started around 7 o'clock that evening, the way Seattle rain always does not, with any warning, just a slow gray darkening of the sky, and then suddenly, everything is soaked and cold and unforgiving. Emily Carter stood on the front steps of the house she had helped design, holding a single suitcase. One suitcase. 12 years of marriage, 11 years of building a company from nothing, thousands of sleepless nights, hundreds of sacrifices, 1 decade of her life poured into a man and a dream, and all she was walking away with was a rolling carry-on and the clothes on her back. The door behind her clicked shut. She didn't knock. She didn't turn around. She just stood there in the rain and let it hit her face, because the cold was the only thing that felt real right now. She was 32 years old, and she had nothing. No, that's not quite right. She had something. She just didn't know what it was yet. Let's go back, because you need to understand who Emily Carter was before Ethan Reynolds decided she was disposable. Emily grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where you either leave or you spend your whole life watching other people leave. She was the daughter of a high school math teacher and a woman who worked double shifts at a diner to make sure Emily could go to college. Her mother used to say, "Emily, you are the sharpest tool in any shed you walk into. Don't you ever let anyone make you forget that." She went to Northwestern on a partial scholarship, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, graduated with honors in computer science and business strategy, and then moved to Seattle in her mid-20s with a head full of ideas and exactly $400 in her checking account. That's where she met Ethan Reynolds. He was 27, she was 24. He had a startup that was hemorrhaging money, a pitch deck full of holes, and a charm that could light up any room he walked into. She saw through the charm immediately. What she fell in love with was the vision underneath it. "You've got the right idea," she told him on their second date, pulling a cocktail napkin toward her and sketching out a revised business model while he stared at her like she'd just performed a magic trick. "But you're solving for the wrong problem. Look, the market doesn't need another project management tool. What the market needs is predictive integration. Here, like this." Ethan stared at the napkin for a long moment. Then he looked up at her with an expression she would come to know very well over the years, that hungry, electrified look of a man who had just realized he'd found something he needed. "Marry me?" he said. She laughed. "Ask me again in 2 years." He did. And she said yes. What happened next was the kind of story that gets told in business school case studies. Emily and Ethan launched Reynolds Technology out of a 2-bedroom apartment. Emily wrote the foundational code. Emily built the early client relationships. Emily was the one who stayed up until 3 in the morning when the servers crashed, the one who reorchestrated their entire product strategy when their first major pivot failed, the one who identified their first enterprise client and personally flew to Chicago to close the deal when Ethan was too sick with the flu to get out of bed. But Ethan was the face. Ethan was the one in the photographs. Ethan was the one whose name appeared in the Forbes profiles and the TechCrunch features and the keynote presentations at industry conferences. And Emily was fine with that. She genuinely was. She wasn't interested in the spotlight. She was interested in the work. She was interested in building something real. "You're the brain," Ethan used to tell her, kissing the top of her head while she worked late into the night. "I'm just the face. We both know who actually runs this thing." She believed him when he said it. That was her first mistake. Success arrived slowly and then all at once. Reynolds Technology hit its first $1 million in revenue in year 3. By year 5, they had their first major acquisition offer, which Emily advised them to decline because she'd already mapped out a growth trajectory that would triple their valuation within 18 months if they stayed independent. She was right. She was almost always right. By year 8, Reynolds Technology was valued at $400 million and climbing. Ethan was on the cover of a business magazine grinning with that lighthouse smile of his, and the headline read, "The Genius of Ethan Reynolds." Emily read the profile over coffee one morning while Ethan slept in. She looked for her name somewhere in the article. It appeared once, in a paragraph near the bottom. Reynolds' wife, Emily, works in an operational capacity at the company. Operational capacity. She set the magazine down, drank her coffee, told herself it didn't matter. That was her second mistake. The change in Ethan didn't happen overnight. That's the thing nobody tells you about watching someone you love become someone else. It's gradual. It's incremental. It happens in moments so small that you convince yourself you're imagining it. It was the way he started interrupting her in meetings. Just small interruptions at first, finishing her sentences before she could get to the point, redirecting conversations when she was mid-thought, laughing off her concerns in front of board members in a way that was technically friendly but functionally dismissive. "Emily worries too much," he'd say, and the room would chuckle, and Emily would smile and say nothing because she understood the theater of executive leadership. But then it was more than that. It was the way he started changing strategy without consulting her, making deals she hadn't approved, hiring people over her direct objections, spending lavishly on corporate events and status symbols, a company jet, a penthouse office suite, a fleet of executive vehicles expenses that Emily had specifically flagged as premature given their growth projections. "We can afford it," he'd say. "Stop being so cautious." "Caution is why we're still here," she'd say back, and he'd give her that look. The new look, the one that said you're becoming inconvenient. She noticed the look. She noted it. She filed it away in the back of her mind, alongside all the other things she was trying not to think about too hard. She was 30 years old, and the company she'd helped build was approaching $1 billion valuation, and her husband was becoming a stranger, and she just kept working because work was the one thing she still knew how to trust. She found out about Chloe Bennett the way most people find out about these things. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a confession, not even a well-timed phone notification. She found out because she was going through the quarterly expense reports, something she did routinely, something she had always done, and there was a charge she didn't recognize. A restaurant in Miami. February 14th, Valentine's Day. Ethan had been in Miami for a conference that weekend. Emily had been home alone, working late, eating takeout, fully supportive of his travel schedule. She stared at the charge for a long time. Then she pulled up the restaurant's Instagram page. There was a photo from that night, a Valentine's Day special post, couples at tables with candles and roses. And in the corner of one photograph, barely visible, almost accidental, was the profile of a man she recognized. Sitting across from a very young, very beautiful woman she did not. Emily closed her laptop, sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. Then she opened it back up and kept working. Because she needed to be sure, and because Emily Carter had never made a decision, not one important decision in her life, without being absolutely certain of her facts first. Over the next 6 weeks, she was certain. She didn't hire a private investigator. She didn't need to. She was a woman who had built data systems for a living. She knew how to find patterns. She knew how to read evidence. She tracked the expense reports, the calendar gaps, the late-night phone usage, the hotel charges billed to a subsidiary account she had to dig through 3 layers of corporate structure to find. Her name was Chloe Bennett, 24 years old, social media influencer, 300,000 Instagram followers, beautiful in the specific way that algorithms favor symmetrical, aspirational, endlessly photographable. The complete opposite of Emily in every way that Ethan now seemed to care about. Emily built a file. She documented everything, and then she did something that surprised even her. She sat with it for 2 more weeks without doing anything at all. Not because she was afraid, not because she was in denial, but because she needed to decide what kind of woman she was going to be on the other side of this moment. She needed to be intentional. She had spent 12 years being intentional about everything: the company, the strategy, the relationships, the sacrifices. She was not going to stop being intentional now. When she finally sat down across from Ethan on a Tuesday evening in November, she was calm. "I know about Chloe," she said. He didn't deny it. She'd almost expected him to. But Ethan Reynolds had reached the particular altitude of wealth and ego where denial felt beneath him. He leaned back in his chair, loosened the collar of his shirt, and looked at her with an expression that she would later describe to no one because she had no one to describe it to as almost bored. "I was going to talk to you about that," he said. "Were you, Emily?" He said her name like a sigh. "You have to know things haven't been working between us for a while." "Have I?" she said. "I've been a little busy helping run a company. Maybe I missed the memo." Something crossed his face. Irritation. "Don't be like that." "Like what?" "Difficult." She looked at him for a long moment. Difficult. That word. She had given this man 12 years. She had given his company everything she had. She had swallowed her own ambitions, her own name, her own public identity, and poured it all into a shared vision. And now that the vision had succeeded, now that the money was real and the power was real and the world was paying attention, she was difficult. "I want a fair settlement," she said. "Half of everything. I helped build it. I'm entitled to half." And that was when Ethan Reynolds showed her exactly who he had become. He didn't yell. That almost would have been better. He smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, the smile of a man who is about to explain something to someone he considers beneath him. And he folded his hands on the table and said very calmly, "That's not going to happen." "I have documentation of my contributions going back 11 years, Emily said. "Every strategy memo, every client communication, every product decision. My lawyers will be very thorough." "My lawyers are better." "Ethan." "Emily." He cut her off, and his voice was smooth and final, like a door being closed. "I think you should understand what your actual position is here. You're my wife. You've been a supportive partner, but Reynolds Technology was founded in my name, incorporated under my holding company, and built by my team. The contributions you made were made as a spouse, not as a founder. There's a difference." She stared at him. "And if you decide to make this ugly," he continued, "I have the resources to make it considerably uglier for you than for me. I'd think very carefully before you decide to fight this." Emily said nothing. She was thinking, but not about whether to fight. She had already decided she would fight. She was thinking, "I built you. I built this company. I know where every body is buried, every decision was made, every number was massaged, and every shortcut was taken. I know this business better than you do. I know it better than your lawyers do. I know it better than anyone in that building does, and one day that is going to matter." She said none of that. She just stood up, walked to the bedroom, and started packing a suitcase. The settlement her lawyers eventually negotiated was deeply unfair. Ethan's legal team was indeed better, or at least better funded and better positioned, to drag proceedings out indefinitely, while Emily, operating on a fraction of the resources, exhausted her savings on legal fees before a final resolution was reached. She walked away with a cash settlement that sounded like a lot of money, until you considered what she was actually entitled to. No equity in Reynolds Technology, no acknowledgement of her foundational contributions, a non-disclosure agreement that prevented her from discussing the details of her role in the company. In other words, silence paid for. She signed it, not because she accepted it as just, but because she was playing a longer game than anyone in that room understood. The night before she left Seattle, Emily sat in her empty apartment. She'd already moved out of the house weeks before and called her mother in Ohio. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Tell me," her mother said. "Just that. No preamble, no platitudes. Just tell me." So Emily told her. The whole thing. The affair, the lawyers, the settlement, the NDA, the suitcase, the rain. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and her voice only broke twice, which she considered a significant personal achievement. When she finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then her mother said, "Do you remember what I used to tell you about tools?" Emily almost laughed. "You are the sharpest tool in any shed you walk into." And what does a sharp tool do when someone tries to throw it away? Emily was quiet. It cuts, her mother said. On its way out. Emily pressed her hand over her eyes. I'm 32, Mom. I'm starting over from nothing. You're starting over from everything. Everything you know is still in your head. Nobody took that from you. Nobody can. Emily sat with that for a while. After she hung up, she didn't cry. She pulled out a legal pad, old habit she'd always thought better on paper, and she wrote a single line at the top. She wrote, "What do I actually know?" And then she started filling in the page. She knew enterprise software architecture at a level most engineers twice her age couldn't match. She knew the pressure points of every major competitor in the market Ethan now dominated. She knew specifically and in detail the limitations of Reynolds Technologies' current platform. The gaps, the vulnerabilities, the things Ethan's team had never solved and didn't have the technical depth to solve. She knew exactly what the market was missing, and she knew that she had the ability to build it. By the time the sun came up over Portland, she'd already decided on Portland, a city where nobody knew her, where she could be anonymous while she rebuilt. She had filled 11 pages of that legal pad. She made herself one promise before she packed it into her bag alongside everything else. Not revenge, not anger, not retribution. Just this: she would build something so undeniably real, so thoroughly excellent, so impossible to dismiss that the world would have no choice but to pay attention. And then, only then, she would decide what to do with that attention. She rolled her suitcase out of the apartment, called a car to the airport, and didn't look back at Seattle. Not once. The first 6 months in Portland almost broke her. Almost. She found an apartment that she could afford on her settlement money if she was careful, a place on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like someone else's cooking and had radiators that clanged all night and a view of a parking garage. She set up a second-hand desk in the corner of the bedroom, bought the fastest laptop she could justify the expense of, and went to work. The depression came anyway. She'd known it might. She'd watched enough people she respected go through crisis to know that you don't outrun the grief, you just get to choose how you move through it. Some mornings she couldn't get out of bed until noon. Some evenings she sat on her bathroom floor and cried until she ran out of tears, and then sat there a little longer just to be sure. She allowed herself exactly 30 minutes of that per day. She'd actually set a timer on her phone. 30 minutes to feel everything: the humiliation, the loss, the rage, the heartbreak, the injustice of it. All of it full volume. Then the timer went off, and she got up, and she went back to work. She started running at 5 in the morning, partly for her mental health and partly because it was the only time the streets were empty enough that she didn't have to perform being okay for anyone else. She rebuilt her body the same way she rebuilt everything, methodically, intentionally, with a plan and a timeline and metrics she tracked in a notebook. By month 3, she had lost the weight she'd accumulated during the stress of the last years of her marriage. By month 5, her sleep had normalized. By month 6, she looked in the mirror one morning and didn't recognize herself, not in the devastating way she'd experienced standing outside the Seattle house in the rain, but in a different way, in a way that felt cautiously like possibility. And through all of it, through the grief and the runs and the 30-minute crying sessions and the sleepless coding nights she was building, the platform she was developing had a working title she'd written at the top of her first notebook: Clarity. It was a predictive intelligence system designed for enterprise integration, which sounds technical and complicated, but the principle was elegantly simple. It solved the exact problem that Reynolds Technologies' platform had been unable to crack for 3 years. She knew it was solvable. She'd known for 3 years that it was solvable. She'd brought the solution framework to Ethan twice, and twice he'd dismissed it as too ambitious for where we are right now. She built it anyway, alone, in a Portland apartment, on a second-hand desk with a fast laptop running on black coffee, and something that had not yet become hope, but was beginning to resemble it from certain angles. She was 32 years old, starting from nothing, carrying the knowledge of a company she could never publicly claim, building a future with her own hands. And she had never, not once in her life, been more certain of anything than she was of this. She was going to make something that mattered. Whatever happened after that, that was a problem for a future version of herself to solve. She made it to Portland on a Tuesday. Nobody knew her there. Nobody looked twice at a woman dragging a single suitcase through the arrivals terminal with dark circles under her eyes and the particular blank expression of someone who has recently had their entire life dismantled. Portland was good for that, a city full of people who had come there specifically to be left alone, which suited Emily Carter just fine. The apartment she rented was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like radiator heat and other people's cooking. The lease was month to month. The furniture was secondhand. The view from her only window was a parking garage. She paid first and last month's rent in cash, set her suitcase in the corner of the bedroom, and sat on the edge of the mattress for a very long time without moving. She wasn't crying. She had already done a significant amount of crying in the car on the way to the Seattle airport alone in the back seat of a rideshare, with her face turned toward the window so the driver wouldn't see. She had allowed herself that. She had allowed herself the full, ugly weight of it. The shaking hands, the short breath, the feeling that something structural inside her chest had been knocked loose and was rattling around without anything to anchor it. But that was Seattle. This was Portland. And Emily Carter had a rule she'd had since college, since the night she'd worked double shifts at a campus restaurant while studying for finals. While sending money home to help her mother with the mortgage, you get to fall apart, but you don't get to stay that way. She pulled out her legal pad. At the top of the first page, she wrote 4 words. What do I actually know? And then she started writing. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. By the time she put the pen down, she had filled 14 pages, not with feelings, not with grievances, with facts, capabilities, market intelligence, technical knowledge that 12 years inside Reynolds Technology had deposited in her brain like sediment, layer after layer of proprietary understanding that no NDA could reach, because it lived inside her mind and not on any company server. She knew the exact structural weakness in Ethan's platform, the integration gap that his engineering team had been trying to solve for 3 years without success, because the engineers he'd hired after pushing Emily out of the technical decision-making process were talented but not visionary, and solving that particular problem required both. She knew the 3 enterprise clients who were quietly, privately unhappy with Reynolds Technology's performance, but hadn't yet moved because switching costs were high and nobody had offered them a compelling enough alternative. She knew the alternative. She had been building it in her head for 2 years during the long nights when Ethan was out and she was at her desk, and her mind wouldn't stop solving problems that technically weren't her problems to solve anymore. She looked at those 14 pages. And for the first time since Ethan had snapped his fingers and summoned security to escort her out of her own life, she felt something other than pain. She felt dangerous, not in an angry way, not in a revenge way, in the specific, focused, clarifying way of a person who has just remembered exactly what they are capable of. She made herself one promise before she closed the legal pad. Not to destroy him, not to humiliate him, not to burn down what he had built, just to build something better. Everything after that would take care of itself. The first 3 months were brutal in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. She had expected the financial stress. She had prepared for it: spreadsheets, budgets, a careful rationing of the settlement money that had to last until she had something real to show investors. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the silence. For 12 years, her days had been structured by noise meetings, calls, decisions, the constant low-grade hum of a company operating at scale. She had complained about it sometimes, the relentlessness of it. Now the quiet of the Portland apartment sat on her chest like physical weight. She started running to fill it. 5 in the morning before the city woke up. Not because she loved running, she had never particularly loved running, but because movement was the only thing that got the noise in her head down to a manageable volume. She ran 4 miles the first week, 6 the second. By the end of the first month, she was running 10 miles before sitting down at her desk, and the endorphins were doing something real and measurable for her mental state, which she tracked in a notebook alongside everything else because Emily Carter tracked everything. She also allowed herself 30 minutes a day to feel terrible. 30 minutes. Timed. She would sit on the bathroom floor if that's where the feeling took her, and she would let it be as bad as it actually was. The humiliation, the injustice, the specific cruelty of watching the man she'd built a life with erase her contributions as if they had never existed. Watching him hand her a settlement, that was an insult disguised as a payment, and then smile about it, she let all of it surface full volume for 30 minutes. Then the timer went off. She got up, she washed her face, she went back to work. It sounds simple when you say it that way. It was not simple. There were mornings she had to physically pick herself up off that bathroom floor by reminding herself, one fact at a time, of what she was building. There were nights she stared at her laptop screen and couldn't make her hands move because the exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was the deeper kind, the kind that comes from grief. And grief doesn't care about your timeline or your business plan. But she kept going. Because here's the thing about Emily Carter that Ethan Reynolds had fundamentally misunderstood. She had never, not once in her life, been motivated primarily by comfort. She had been motivated by the problem in front of her. And right now, the problem in front of her was the most interesting, most important, most personal problem she had ever been handed. How do you rebuild a life when someone has done everything in their power to ensure you have nothing to rebuild with? You start with what they couldn't take. She called her mother every Sunday. Her mother, who had worked double shifts at an Ohio diner for 20 years without complaint, who had sent Emily to college on tips and sheer stubbornness, who had the particular wisdom of a woman who had survived everything the world threw at her by refusing to be defined by any of it. "Tell me where you are this week," her mother would say. Not "how are you," because "how are you" invites performance. "Where are you" invites truth. "I'm scared," Emily said one Sunday about 2 months in. "I'm building something real. I know it's real. But some days I wake up and I think, what if I'm wrong? What if I've just convinced myself I'm capable because the alternative is too terrible to accept?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember your 3rd grade science fair?" she finally said. Emily almost laughed despite herself. "Mom, do you remember it?" "Yes. You built a working model of a water filtration system out of materials you found in the garage. You were 8 years old. Your teacher told me afterward that she'd had college students who couldn't explain what you explained that day." Her mother's voice was steady and certain the way it always was. "You have never once in your life convinced yourself you were capable of something you weren't. That's not who you are. You know the difference. You've always known the difference." Emily held the phone and said nothing. "Keep building," her mother said. She kept building. By month 4, Clarity, the name she'd given her platform, the predictive intelligence system she'd been architecting since before she even left Seattle, had a working prototype that she tested obsessively, running it against real market scenarios, using publicly available data, watching it perform in ways that made her stomach tighten, with something that was starting to feel carefully like pride. The system was good. It was better than good. It was solving in 48 hours what Reynolds Technologies' team had been unable to solve in 3 years. And she knew that, not because she was biased toward her own work, she was constitutionally incapable of that kind of bias. It was one of her most reliable qualities, but because she tested it against every benchmark she knew existed, and it outperformed all of them. She needed an investor. Not a traditional investor, not the kind who would want a board seat and control and the ability to redirect her vision according to their quarterly returns. She needed the specific rare kind of investor who understood technology at a deep enough level to recognize what she had built without needing her to dumb it down and who valued intelligence over polish. She began researching. She built a list of 43 names, 43 people in the technology investment world who fit her criteria. Track record, philosophy, portfolio pattern, public statements about what they looked for in founders. She ranked them weighted by compatibility and accessibility. Then she worked down the list. She attended 3 industry events in San Francisco over the course of 6 weeks, using the last of her discretionary spending money to cover travel, staying in budget accommodations, wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation, because she had gotten very efficient at not caring about things that didn't matter. The first 2 events produced nothing useful. Good conversations exchanged cards, the performance of networking that she had always found slightly exhausting. Nobody she met was on her list of 43. The 3rd event was different. It was a private technology conference, smaller, more selective. The kind of gathering where the badges didn't have company logos on them, because everyone there already knew who everyone was. Emily had gotten access through a former colleague who owed her a favor and didn't ask too many questions. She was standing near the window holding a glass of water she didn't drink at events where she needed to be sharp and reviewing a conversation she'd just had with a venture capitalist who had been technically impressive but philosophically wrong when someone appeared beside her. "You look like the smartest person in this room who's actively trying not to be noticed," he said. She turned. He was in his mid-50s with the kind of face that had interesting lines in it, the kind that come from a life of thinking hard about difficult things. Not conventionally handsome, but compelling. He held his glass the way confident people do, loosely without the performance of casualness. His name was Daniel Cole, number 7 on her list of 43. She had done enough research on him to write a dissertation. Billionaire investor, built and sold 2 enterprise software companies before the age of 40. Known in the industry for an almost unsettling ability to identify foundational technology before the market understood why it mattered. Also known, according to 3 separate sources, she considered reliable for being genuinely uninterested in people who weren't worth his time, which meant he spent his time with interesting people, because interesting people were the only ones who got past his particular kind of direct. She did not introduce herself immediately. Instead, she said, "The smartest person in this room is trying not to be noticed, because the smartest person in this room is the only one here who doesn't need to be validated by being noticed." He looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled a real smile, not a networking smile. "That's either the most arrogant thing I've heard all week or the most honest. I can't decide which." "With respect," she said, "why can't it be both?" He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that surprised him slightly, which she noted. "Daniel Cole," he said, extending his hand. "I know who you are," she said. She shook his hand. "Emily Carter." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition quickly recalibrated. He knew the name. She had expected he might. Ethan's divorce had not been entirely private, and her name had appeared in a few industry whisper networks in connection with Reynolds Technologies' founding history. "I've heard of you," he said carefully. "I know," she said. "What you've heard is incomplete. But that's not your fault. Most of what's publicly available about my role in Reynolds Technology was managed by people who had a significant financial interest in minimizing it." He studied her. "That's a direct thing to say." "I've found that direct is more efficient," she said, "especially with people whose time is genuinely worth money." Another pause. He was evaluating. She let him. "What are you building?" he asked. She looked at him for 3 full seconds before answering. Not for drama, because she was deciding in real time exactly how much to show him and in what order. "A predictive intelligence integration system for enterprise clients," she said. "It solves a structural problem in the current market that the dominant platform, which I helped architect, by the way, has been unable to address. I have a working prototype. I have a go-to-market strategy. I have 3 potential anchor clients who are currently dissatisfied with their existing solution and don't know yet that I'm going to offer them a better one." "Reynolds Technology," he said, not a question. "The problem they can't solve and the clients they're losing," she confirmed. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man who is running very fast calculations in his head. "How long did it take you to build the prototype?" 4 months, working alone with personal funds on equipment that was decidedly non-enterprise grade. He raised an eyebrow. "Alone." "Alone," she said. "And the integration architecture, is it proprietary?" "Fully. I developed the framework independently, post-NDA expiration. My lawyers have reviewed it thoroughly." She paused. "I anticipated that question." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen in a very long time. Not attraction, though perhaps that too, she noted, without particular investment, but something deeper and more useful. Respect. Real respect. The kind that doesn't come with conditions. "I'd like to see it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I came to this event." He laughed again, shorter this time, surprised again. "You came specifically for me. You're number 7 on my list of potential investors," she said. "You moved to number 1 after I had a conversation earlier tonight with numbers 4 and 12, and found them both philosophically incompatible with what I'm building. You had a list." "I always have a list." He shook his head slowly, and she couldn't quite read the expression on his face, but it wasn't negative. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." What happened at Reynolds Technology with your ex-husband? What actually happened? The question landed with weight, and she felt the familiar pull of old pain trying to surface. She let it arrive, acknowledged it silently, and set it aside with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 4 months building that particular muscle. A man decided that the person who helped him build something was less valuable than the lifestyle that something had purchased for him, she said. And then he acted on that decision without considering that the person he was discarding was significantly more capable than he had allowed himself to fully understand. Daniel Cole was quiet. That's the professional answer, she added. The personal answer is harder. But we've just met, and I think the professional answer is sufficient for now. He nodded slowly. Fair. They talked for another 2 hours. Not networking talk. Real talk, technical, specific. The kind of conversation where both people are operating at full capacity and neither one is performing anything for the other. He challenged her on her architecture. She defended it and then identified a genuine weakness before he could point it out and explained how she planned to address it. He pushed on her market analysis. She pushed back, cited specific data, and adjusted one of her projections in real time when his counterargument revealed a variable she hadn't fully weighted. By the end of the evening, they were the last 2 people in the conference room. He looked at her with that expression again, the real one. I want to see the full prototype, he said, in person. Can you be in San Francisco next Thursday? Yes, she said. She could not, practically speaking, easily afford another trip to San Francisco. She had already stretched her budget thin on these 3 events, but she looked at Daniel Cole and she thought about the 14 pages in her legal pad and the 4 months of 5 a.m. runs and 30-minute crying sessions and secondhand desk and parking garage view and her mother's voice saying, keep building, and she said yes without hesitation. Because you do not say no to the moment you've been building toward. The Thursday meeting lasted 6 hours. She arrived at Daniel's San Francisco office at 9 in the morning with her laptop and a folder of documentation and the calm, focused energy of someone who has been preparing for a specific conversation for approximately 4 months. She presented clarity in full. Not a pitch deck, not a sales performance. A genuine technical walkthrough architecture methodology test results, projected applications, competitive positioning, and the specific demonstrable ways in which it outperformed the current market leader. Daniel sat across from her and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. She had expected this. She had read enough about him to know that silence during a presentation was not disengagement. It was concentration. When she finished, he leaned forward, put his elbows on the table and said, "Show me the integration failure scenario, the edge case on multi-system environments." She showed him. He watched the test run 3 times. Then he sat back. "This is real," he said. "Yes," she said. "This is actually real." "I'm aware." He looked at her. "Why didn't you build this while you were at Reynolds Technology?" She met his eyes. "I tried, twice. I was told it was too ambitious." Something moved across his face. Not pity, she would have found pity intolerable. Something more like the recognition of a specific kind of waste. The specific damage that happens when a person in power makes a decision based on ego instead of intelligence. "He had no idea what he had," Daniel said quietly. "It wasn't really a question." "No," Emily said. "He didn't." A silence. Then Daniel said, "What do you need?" And Emily, who had prepared for this moment as carefully as she had prepared for everything else, opened her folder, slid a single page across the table and said, "Everything on that page. Not $1 more, not $1 less. I've modeled the funding requirements down to the quarter. If you deviate from the structure, the timeline shifts, and we lose the window on client acquisition." He looked at the page, looked up at her. "You've already identified the clients." "I've already had preliminary conversations with 2 of them," she said, "under a consulting identity. They don't know yet that I'm the founder of what I'll be offering them. That reveal has been strategically timed." He was quiet for another moment. "You've been planning this since before you left Seattle," he said. She held his gaze. "I've been planning this since I sat across from my ex-husband in a room where I knew more about his company than he did, and watched him tell me I had no claim to what I'd built." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have just understood each other completely. Daniel Cole picked up a pen. He wrote one word at the bottom of her page. Yes. Then he looked up. I have one condition. She waited. Equal partnership, he said. I don't want a founder-investor relationship. I want a co-founder structure. You bring the technology and the vision. I bring the capital and the network. We build this together as equals, and we don't deviate from that structure regardless of what the market pressure looks like down the road. Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Ethan, about 12 years of building something together, or so she had believed, only to discover that together had always meant something different to him than it had meant to her. About what it felt like to pour yourself into a shared vision and then discover, when the vision succeeded, that the other person had always intended to keep it all. She thought about her mother, about the word equals, about what it would have meant to hear that word at 24 from the man she had loved. Equal partnership, she said. And that's in writing, structured into the corporate formation documents, not just a verbal commitment. Obviously, Daniel said, and he sounded almost offended that she'd thought she needed to specify. She almost smiled. Then yes. They shook hands. And in that San Francisco office on a Thursday afternoon, 18 months after Ethan Reynolds had snapped his fingers and had her escorted out of her own life, Emily Carter signed the founding documents for a company that she and Daniel Cole agreed to call Clarity Systems. Nobody in the technology world noticed. Nobody was paying attention to a quiet, privately held startup with no press release and no social media footprint, led by a woman most of the industry had never heard of. That was exactly the point, because Emily had learned something in 12 years inside a company built on visibility and performance and the relentless cultivation of public perception. She had learned that the most powerful moves are the ones nobody sees coming. She had learned that the best time to be underestimated is right before you make your most important move. And for the next 3.5 years, while Ethan Reynolds held press conferences and appeared on magazine covers and accepted industry awards for innovation, while he promoted himself as the singular visionary genius behind one of America's great technology success stories, while all of that was happening very publicly in the full light of the world's attention, Emily Carter was building in the dark, quietly, methodically, with the focused, unhurried certainty of someone who is not racing toward a deadline, but rather constructing something meant to last. She hired selectively small teams, exceptional people, vetted with a rigor that occasionally made Daniel raise his eyebrows. You turned down 3 candidates today that I thought were strong, he said one afternoon, looking up from a stack of interview assessments. They were technically strong, she said without looking up from her own work. 2 of them were not people I could trust with what we're building. And one of them, the third one, has been in contact with someone at Reynolds Technology. I traced it through a shared network connection on his professional profile. Daniel stared at her. How long have you been monitoring for that? Since we started hiring, she said simply. He put down the assessments. Emily. Yes. You are genuinely alarming sometimes. She looked up, and for the first time in a long time in this office, in this partnership, that had started to feel like the first real equal ground she'd stood on in years, she let herself smile. A real smile, the kind she hadn't been sure she still had. Good, she said. The platform launched in soft release 18 months after that limited clients-controlled rollout, no public announcement. The 3 enterprise clients she had identified in Portland, the ones who had been quietly unhappy with Reynolds Technology, became Clarity's first contracted customers. The results were immediate and decisive. Implementation timelines were cut by 40% compared to the industry standard. Integration failures, the specific category of problem that had plagued the dominant platform, dropped to near zero. Client satisfaction metrics came back at numbers that made even Emily pause and look at them twice to make sure she was reading correctly. She was reading correctly. Daniel sent her a message at 11:30 on the night they got the first round of client performance data. It said, I think we need to talk about the next phase. She replied immediately because she was still at her desk at 11:30. She wrote, I've already started the deck. He sent back a single word, naturally. And somewhere in Seattle, in the glass and steel tower that bore his name, Ethan Reynolds was having dinner at an industry gala, with Chloe on his arm accepting a leadership award from an organization that had never once spoken with Emily Carter, laughing with men who believed the story he had told about himself. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that the woman he had escorted out of his house with a single suitcase had spent the last 4.5 years building the instrument of his reckoning, not with rage, not with revenge, but with the same quiet intelligence that had built his company in the first place. He had thrown away the sharpest tool in the room, and the tool had spent 4.5 years sharpening itself. The invitation arrived on a Monday morning, delivered to Clarity Systems' San Francisco headquarters in a thick cream envelope with embossed lettering that Daniel held up between two fingers like it was a slightly dangerous object. "The Apex Technology Gala," he said, reading the front. "New York City, 6 weeks from now." He set it on Emily's desk. "Every major player in the industry. Keynote speakers, live deal announcements, the full circus." He paused. "Ethan Reynolds is one of the featured honorees." Emily didn't look up from her laptop. "I know," she said. "I've known for 3 months." Daniel stared at her. "You've known." "I've been tracking the gala's planning committee through their public announcements and a few industry contacts." She typed 2 more lines of code, then closed the laptop and looked at him. "Ethan is receiving the Industry Visionary Award. The ceremony is on the second night. Our client Meridian Group is also attending. Marcus Webb will be there, and he's been wanting to discuss our Series B integration timeline in person. So you want to go?" "I think we should go," she said. "Clarity is ready for a larger stage. We've been operating in controlled silence for long enough. The soft launch numbers are stronger than our most aggressive projections. The product is bulletproof. And the timing—" She paused, and something moved briefly across her face that Daniel had learned over 4.5 years of working alongside her to read as controlled intensity. "The timing is right." He looked at her for a moment, not at the business case, at her. "Emily," he said carefully, "he's going to be there." "Yes," she said. "And you're sure you want to do this?" She met his eyes. "I have never been more sure of anything in my professional life." He studied her for another few seconds. Then he picked up the invitation. "I'll have our team RSVP today." She nodded and opened her laptop again. "Tell them we'll need 2 seats at the primary table. And make sure our name tag reads Clarity Systems, not the holding company. I want the name visible." Daniel paused at the door. "Any other instructions?" She didn't look up. "Wear the charcoal suit, not the navy one. The charcoal reads better under event lighting." He shook his head and left, and Emily sat alone in the office for a long moment after his footsteps faded down the hallway. She put her hands flat on the desk, breathed, because here is what she hadn't told Daniel, what she hadn't told anyone. She had not tracked the Apex Gala Planning Committee for 3 months, purely for strategic business reasons. She had tracked it because she had known with a certainty that lived below logic and above emotion that this event was the moment. Not for revenge, she had meant what she said in Portland on that first night with the legal pad when she promised herself that revenge was not the point, but for something more important than revenge, for truth, for the moment when the story that had been told about who built what and who mattered and who was disposable would have to contend finally with evidence. She had been building toward this moment for 4.5 years. She was not going to waste it. The 6 weeks between the invitation and the gala were the most focused of Emily's professional life, which was saying something considerable given the entire arc of the last 5 years. She and Daniel spent the first 2 weeks finalizing Clarity's public launch strategy because the Apex Gala was not going to be a soft introduction. It was going to be the moment they stepped out of the quiet and into the light, and everything needed to be precisely in position before that happened. The press release was prepared and scheduled. The website, which had been intentionally minimal during the development phase, was redesigned overnight by their team to reflect the company's full capability. 3 additional enterprise clients, 2 of whom had been in extended negotiations for months, were gently pressured to sign before the gala date, and they did, because the product was undeniable, and because Emily Carter had a way of making people understand that the moment to act was now. She also spent 2 weeks preparing herself, not her pitch, not her presentation, herself. She had changed substantially in 5 years, she knew this. Intellectually had tracked it the same way she tracked everything, but she had been living inside the change so gradually that she had not fully absorbed what it meant from the outside. She asked a trusted colleague, a woman named Priya, who had worked alongside her since the early days of Clarity and whose judgment she respected completely, to be direct with her. "Tell me what you see," Emily said. "Not what's flattering, what's true." Priya looked at her for a moment. "You want the real answer. Always." "You walk differently," Priya said. "Like you used to walk like someone who was trying not to take up too much space. Now you walk like someone who has already decided the space is hers." She paused. "Also, your posture is completely different, and you've lost I don't know how much weight, but it's not just that. It's that you look like you're comfortable in your body in a way you weren't before, like you stopped apologizing for it." Emily considered this. "And professionally, how do I read to someone who doesn't know me?" Priya didn't hesitate. "Dangerous," she said, "in the best possible way. Like someone who knows something the rest of the room doesn't know yet." Emily nodded slowly. "Good." That was the word she'd said to Daniel months ago in a different context for the same reason. Good. Not because she wanted to be intimidating, because she wanted to be underestimated one last time by the right person in the right room. The gala was held on a Friday evening in November, 5 years to the month after Ethan Reynolds had handed her divorce papers across a marble table and told her to sign or face something worse. Emily and Daniel arrived separately, which had been Emily's specific request. She arrived 40 minutes after Daniel, after the room was full, after the initial rush of arrivals had settled into the comfortable noise of industry people networking with industry people. She had timed it this way. Not for drama, or not purely for drama, because she had learned in 12 years inside a company that lived on optics that timing is everything and entrance is strategy. She wore a deep navy gown, not the sequined performative kind that said, "Look at me." The kind that said, "I am not here for your approval, and I know exactly what I'm doing." Her hair was different from the way she'd worn it in her Reynolds technology years. Then it had always been pulled back, practical, a concession to the laboratory-adjacent nature of her work. Now it framed her face in a way that Priya had helped her understand was simply more accurate to who she had become. She walked into that ballroom and the noise didn't stop. Nobody gasped. Nobody turned to look, because nobody recognized her. And that was the whole point. She found Daniel at a table near the center of the room and sat beside him with the composure of someone arriving at a meeting she has prepared for thoroughly. "He's at the front table," Daniel said quietly, not turning his head. "Arrived an hour ago. Chloe's with him." Emily accepted a glass of water from a passing server and looked straight ahead. "I know. I saw them when I came in. And—" She took a sip of water. "And nothing. I'm here to do business." She set the glass down. "Where's Marcus Webb?" Daniel nodded slightly to the left. "Table 8. He's with his CFO. They both saw us arrive and they've looked over twice." "Good. I'll go to them at the cocktail break. Not before I don't want to seem eager." She smoothed the napkin across her lap. "Who else do we know in this room?" For the next 2 hours, Emily Carter worked that room with the quiet, systematic precision of someone executing a plan they have run through many times in their head. She spoke with Marcus Webb during the cocktail break and confirmed the Series B timeline in 45 minutes of conversation that his CFO later told Daniel was the most efficient meeting she'd ever been part of. She introduced herself to 2 potential clients she had identified in advance, and both conversations ended with commitments to schedule formal presentations. She spoke with a journalist from a technology publication who wrote specifically about enterprise innovation and who would, Emily knew, find Clarity's story irresistible once she understood what it was. But she managed that conversation carefully, giving enough to establish interest without revealing anything before the official press release dropped the following morning. She was efficient. She was focused. She was in complete control. And then at exactly 9:17 in the evening, Ethan Reynolds walked up behind her. She knew he was there before he spoke. She had been tracking his position in the room at intervals for the past hour, not obsessively. Not emotionally, the way she might have 18 months ago if this had happened before she was ready. Just awareness. The way you track a variable you know is going to become relevant at some point. "Excuse me?" he said to her back. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face directed at her before. Open curiosity, the slightly heightened attention of a man who has seen someone attractive across a room and followed it. He had no recognition in his eyes. None. Not a flicker. She was a stranger to him. 5 years. A new city, a new body, a new way of carrying herself through the world, and the man who had slept beside her for 12 years looked at her face and saw someone he had never met. Something moved through her. Not pain, or not only pain. Something more complex than that. The particular vertiginous feeling of having been proven right about something you had hoped you were wrong about. He really had never seen her, not the real her, not in 12 years. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Ethan said, and his voice had the smooth, practiced warmth of a man who had spent years being the most important person in whatever room he entered. "I'm Ethan Reynolds." She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. "I know who you are," she said. He smiled. "You have me at a disadvantage." "I usually do," she said pleasantly. Emily Carter." She watched his face. Nothing. Not a flinch, not a hesitation, not even a micro-expression of recognition. The name Emily Carter, the name of the woman he had married, built a company with, and then discarded, produced zero response in Ethan Reynolds at a technology gala in New York City 5 years later. She felt Daniel appear at her elbow and she appreciated his timing. "Ethan Reynolds," Daniel said, extending his hand with the easy confidence of someone who doesn't need to perform anything. "Daniel Cole, I don't think we've met formally, though I've followed your company's work." Ethan's attention shifted to Daniel with the alert recognition of a man who knew the name. "Daniel Cole, of course. I've been meaning to reach out. I think there might be some interesting overlap between what Reynolds Technology is doing in the integration space and—" "Actually," Daniel said, "you might find that interesting given that Emily is the CEO of Clarity Systems, which is, as I understand it, doing some rather significant things in precisely the integration space you're referencing." Ethan turned back to Emily. Now there was interest layered over the initial curiosity, the business kind, the kind that evaluated and calculated. "Clarity Systems. I've heard the name recently. You're the company behind the Meridian Group implementation." "Among others," Emily said. "That integration data is impressive," he said. "The failure rate reduction, I had my team pull your numbers when Meridian started talking. I'll be honest, I was skeptical. The architecture would have to be fundamentally different from anything currently in the market to produce those results." He looked at her with the particular expression of someone issuing a challenge disguised as a compliment. "How'd you crack it?" Emily tilted her head slightly. "Which part specifically?" "The multi-system environment problem, the edge case on simultaneous data streams. Nobody solved that cleanly." She looked at him steadily. "I solved it by understanding where the existing approach was making a foundational error in its integration logic. Once you identify the error, the solution is relatively direct. It just requires being willing to discard an assumption that the dominant market player had established as standard." Something shifted in his expression. Professional respect fighting with something that might have been discomfort. "Which assumption?" he said. "That the system should be reactive rather than predictive," she said. "Reynolds Technology built a reactive integration architecture. It's well executed, but the fundamental premise limits its ceiling. Clarity operates on a predictive model. It doesn't respond to integration failures, it anticipates and prevents them." Ethan was very still. Because here is what Emily knew, and what Ethan was only now beginning to process. She had just described in 4 sentences the exact limitation that his own engineering team had been unable to articulate clearly after 3 years of trying. She had described the problem better than his own people had, and she had described the solution as if it were obvious, which to her it had always been. He stopped, started again. "That's the approach I've had my team exploring for 2 years. "I know," she said. He looked at her sharply. "You know, it's a logical direction to explore once you've identified the reactive architecture limitation," she said, perfectly neutral. I'd imagine any strong engineering team working on the problem would eventually arrive there. The challenge is execution. The predictive model requires a different foundational architecture from the ground up. You can't retrofit it onto an existing reactive system, which is why I expect your team has found the exploration difficult. Ethan's jaw had tightened slightly. She watched it happen. The micro-tension of a man who is being told very politely, very professionally, that the problem he thought was uniquely difficult was not difficult to the person across from him. "Where did you come from?" he said. And now his voice had a different quality, something searching underneath the professional surface. Before clarity, here it was. She had planned this moment. She had played it through in her head dozens of times, considering different approaches, different phrasings, different emotional registers. She had considered being indirect. She had considered being cryptic. She had considered letting him figure it out himself, slowly, over the course of the evening. But Emily Carter had always believed that clarity, real clarity, the kind she'd named her company after, was the most powerful tool available to anyone. So she looked at Ethan Reynolds, the man who had snapped his fingers and had her removed from her own life with a single suitcase, and she told him the truth. "Before clarity," she said calmly, "I spent 11 years as the primary architect and chief strategy officer of Reynolds Technology." She paused, though my operational title at the time was considerably less accurate. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which Ethan Reynolds' face went through a series of expressions that Emily catalogued with the detached precision of someone who has been anticipating this moment for half a decade. First, confusion, the active kind, the kind where the brain is receiving information that doesn't fit any existing category. Then recalculation. She watched him look at her face, really look for the first time since he'd walked over, and begin the process of mapping what he saw onto what he remembered. The posture, the eyes, the specific quality of intelligence in the way she'd just dismantled his technical assumptions in 3 sentences. Then recognition, not the warm kind, the cold dropping "this cannot be happening" kind. "Emily," he said, and this time her name in his mouth sounded completely different than it had 2 minutes ago. "Hello, Ethan," she said. The color had changed in his face. Not dramatically, Ethan Reynolds was a man who had spent years managing his public presentation, and that training didn't desert him even now. But she knew his face. She had known his face for 12 years. She saw what was underneath the composure. You're Emily Carter," he said. "My Emily Carter." "I was never yours," she said, not harshly, factually. "But yes, I'm Emily Carter." Daniel, who had been standing slightly to the side in a silence so complete and considered that Emily made a mental note to thank him for it, later chose this precise moment to check his watch and say very naturally, "I think the dinner seating is about to be called. Emily, shall we?" She held Ethan's gaze for 1 more second. Then she turned to Daniel. "Yes, let's." She walked away from Ethan Reynolds with the same calm, straight-backed posture she had walked into that ballroom with, and she did not look back. But her heart was doing something complicated in her chest that she didn't fully have language for. Not triumph, or not only triumph, something more layered than that. The feeling of a chapter ending that you have been writing for 5 years and the strange, unmoored vertigo of arriving at the last page. The dinner announcement was indeed being called, and the room reorganized itself around tables, and Emily sat beside Daniel and across from Marcus Webb's CFO, and spent the next 45 minutes being professionally excellent, while every cell in her body was acutely, precisely aware of exactly where Ethan Reynolds was sitting in that room. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his attention from across the ballroom. Not the admiring, curious attention of an hour ago, but the heavy, recalibrating attention of a man who has just had the ground shift under him and is trying to figure out what to do with his feet. She had known it would feel something like this. She hadn't known it would feel this significant. It was Marcus Webb who brought it back to business, as Marcus Webb reliably did, leaning across the table during the salad course and saying, "Emily, I have to ask the Series B expansion. My board has been asking about timeline certainty. Can we lock the March milestone?" And Emily Carter set aside everything else, the history, the recognition, the weight of 5 years arriving at once, and answered the question with the full focus of someone who had built her entire adult life around knowing that the work always comes first. "March is locked," she said. "Tell your board." Marcus nodded satisfied and returned to his plate. Daniel caught her eye briefly across the table. She gave him the smallest possible nod. He returned it with equal economy. And that was when the evening's program began, and the host took the stage, and the Apex Technology Gala moved into its official proceedings, keynotes and presentations, and award announcements. And Emily sat in her seat with her hands folded and her expression composed, and her mind operating at the same quiet, lethal clarity it always operated at. The Industry Visionary Award came near the end of the program. Emily watched Ethan walk to the stage. She watched him accept the award from the host. She watched him stand at the podium with the lighthouse smile she had once found irresistible and speak for 8 minutes about innovation and vision and the responsibility of technology leadership to shape a better future. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. That was never the thing she had questioned. What she questioned, what she had always known, and what tonight had proved with the quiet finality of a closed case file, was the story underneath the performance. The story of who actually built what. The story the award didn't know to tell. He found her again during the post-dinner reception, moving through the crowd with the deliberate purpose of a man who has made a decision. She saw him coming and stayed exactly where she was. "I need to talk to you," he said. His voice was lower now, stripped of the public performance. "We're talking," she said, "privately." She looked at him. "I don't think that's necessary." "Emily." He said her name differently now, not the smooth social version from earlier, not the cold recognition version from the great reveal. Something more raw than either, something that sounded almost for the first time in a very long time, like the man she had originally loved. "What you built, Clarity. I had no idea. I didn't know you were—" "I know you didn't," she said quietly. "That was the point." He stared at her. "You built this to compete with Reynolds Technology. I built this because I knew how to solve a problem that the market needed solved, and I had both the capability and the motivation to solve it. The fact that the dominant market player is your company is a consequence of the market, not the motivation." "That's—" He stopped, pressed his mouth closed for a moment. "That's very precise. I've had 5 years to think about exactly how I wanted to say it." Something crossed his face, a complicated something. "The Meridian Group. They were ours. They were unhappy with your product," she said. "They made a rational business decision. Who else?" She looked at him evenly. "I'm not going to list our client portfolio for you in the middle of an industry event, Ethan. Are you going after Reynolds Technology?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, because she was deciding how much of it to give him. "I'm building the best enterprise intelligence platform in the market," she finally said. "That's the only goal I've ever had. What Reynolds Technology does in response to that is your decision to make." He looked at her for a long time, and in that look, in the complicated shifting landscape of his expression, she saw something she had not expected to see and was not entirely prepared for. She saw regret, not the performed self-serving kind, the real kind, the kind that arrives too late and knows it. "I made a mistake," he said. She held his gaze. "With the company," he said, "and with you, the way I—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. His jaw worked briefly. "The way I handled things, it was wrong." The ballroom noise continued around them. People laughed at nearby tables. A waiter passed with a tray of glasses. The ordinary machinery of a room full of successful people having a successful evening. Emily Carter stood in the middle of all of it and looked at the man who had once been the center of her world, and she felt not the rage she had expected to feel in this moment, not the triumph, not the vindication, something quieter, something that lived in the same place as the 30-minute crying sessions and the 5 a.m. runs and the legal pad with 14 pages of what she actually knew. "Yes," she said simply, "it was." She didn't say anything else. She didn't say "I forgive you" because she wasn't sure yet that she did, and she had never been in the habit of saying things she wasn't sure of. She didn't say "You'll pay for this" because that was never what this had been about. She didn't say "I still think about the person you used to be" because that was true. But it was private, and she had learned in 5 years that not everything true needed to be spoken aloud. She just held his gaze for one more moment, and then she said, "Good night, Ethan." And she turned and walked back toward Daniel, toward Marcus Webb, toward the table where Clarity Systems was represented by 2 people who had built something real, and she did not look back. Not because she was performing composure, because she was genuinely done. The recognition she had wanted not from Ethan personally, but from the world, from the industry, from the market that had accepted a false narrative about who had built what was already in motion. The press release would drop in the morning. The client list would become public record. The architecture of Clarity would be analyzed and discussed and credited to its actual creator. The story was about to be corrected. Not by a confrontation, not by a lawsuit or a scandal or a public accusation, by something far more durable than any of those things, by the simple, undeniable fact of excellence. Daniel appeared beside her, reading her face with the accuracy that 4.5 years of close partnership had given him. "You okay?" She thought about it for a second. Actually, thought about it rather than reaching for the automatic fine. "I think so," she said. "Anything I need to know." He apologized, she said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. And it was real, she said, which I hadn't expected. She picked up her glass of water. "It doesn't change anything, but it was real." He nodded once. "What do you want to do for the rest of the evening?" She looked around the room at the clients she'd moved the conversation she'd had, the seed of the story that would grow from this night into something the industry would talk about for years. "I want to have one more conversation with the journalist from Tech Forward," she said. "And then I want to go back to the hotel and sleep for 8 hours because tomorrow morning the press release goes live and we are going to have an extraordinary amount of work to do." Daniel almost smiled. "That's the plan." "That's always the plan," she said. And Emily Carter moved back into the room, composed, precise, purposeful, and entirely herself. The woman who had walked into this building as a stranger, the woman nobody had recognized, the woman who by this time tomorrow everyone would know. The press release went live at 6 in the morning. Emily was already awake. She had been awake since 4:30, sitting at the small desk in her hotel room with her laptop open and her coffee going cold beside her, reading through the final version one last time, even though she had already read it 11 times and knew there was nothing to change. Some habits don't break, even when there's no longer any practical reason for them. At 6:01, her phone buzzed. "Daniel, it's live." At 6:04, it buzzed again. Daniel TechCrunch picked it up already. They had someone monitoring the wire. At 6:11, 3 more notifications, industry newsletters, a technology podcast that published breaking news alerts, a financial wire service. By 6:30, her inbox had received 47 emails. By 7, it was 112. She sat in that hotel room and watched her phone fill up with the world reacting to the story of Clarity Systems, to the platform's capability, to the client list, to the funding structure, and buried in paragraph 4 of the TechCrunch piece, in language that was careful but precise to the identity of its founder, Emily Carter, formerly of Reynolds Technology, where she had served in a senior operational capacity during the company's founding years, formerly of Reynolds Technology. Senior operational capacity. Even now, even in a story that was fundamentally about her, the language hedged. The story was careful, but it was there, and it was true, and it was the beginning of a correction that would only become more complete as time passed and more people looked closely at what Clarity had built and started asking the questions that the full answer required. She got dressed, drank a fresh cup of coffee, and went downstairs to meet Daniel for breakfast. He was already at a corner table with his own phone face up and 2 newspapers beside his plate. He looked up when she sat down. "Good morning," he said. "You've been awake since 4:30. 4:28, she said. "How do you feel?" She picked up the coffee pot and poured, like someone who has a great deal of work to do today. He almost smiled. "The Tech Forward journalist sent a message this morning. She wants a full sit-down interview. She's describing it to her editor as the most significant enterprise technology story of the year." Schedule it for next week, Emily said. After we're back in San Francisco, tell her she'll have full access and I'll answer every question she has. She specifically asked about your time at Reynolds Technology. Emily took a sip of coffee. I know. Tell her I'll answer every question she has. Daniel set his phone down and looked at her directly. Emily, the NDA. The NDA covered my direct characterization of my contributions as a legal claim against Reynolds Technology, she said. It did not prohibit me from discussing my professional history in a journalistic context, particularly given that the statute of limitations on the NDA's most restrictive provisions expired 14 months ago. She picked up the menu. My lawyers reviewed the interview parameters 3 weeks ago. We're fine. Daniel stared at her. You've been planning the interview for 3 weeks. I've been planning the interview since I signed the NDA, she said pleasantly. What's good here, I'm thinking eggs. He sat back in his chair and made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a surrendered sigh. You are the most exhausting person I have ever worked with. And yet you signed an equal partnership agreement, she said. Best decision I ever made, he said, and he meant it. And they both knew he meant it. And that was the kind of working relationship Emily Carter had spent 12 years not having and had finally at 37 actually built. She ordered eggs. She ate them. She went back upstairs and began returning calls. What happened over the next 72 hours was the kind of thing that business journalists write about in retrospect once the full shape of events becomes visible from a distance. In the moment living inside it, it felt less like a dramatic reversal and more like a series of very consequential dominoes falling in the order they had always been going to fall. The first domino was Marcus Webb. Marcus called Emily directly at 9:15 Saturday morning while she was still in the hotel, 3 hours after the press release had gone live. And approximately 2 hours after she would learn later, he had received a call from Ethan Reynolds' office asking for a meeting to discuss the Reynolds Technology contract renewal. I've already told their team that we're not renewing, Marcus said without preamble, because Marcus Webb was a man who treated directness as a professional courtesy. I wanted you to hear it from me before it became public. Emily kept her voice neutral. Marcus, you should make that decision based on what's right for Meridian, not based on... It is based on what's right for Meridian, he said flatly. Your platform outperforms theirs by a margin that my board can no longer justify ignoring. That's the decision. The only reason it wasn't made 6 months ago is that we didn't have a signed alternative. A pause. We have one now. The March timeline holds, Emily said. I know it does. That's why I'm calling you first. Another pause, and then in a slightly different register, Emily, that TechCrunch piece, the part about your history at Reynolds. He stopped. I want you to know that if I had understood at the time when we were evaluating vendors that you were the architect of the original platform, we would have come to you first, 3 years ago. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said finally, but we're here now. We're here now, he agreed. She hung up and sat still for 60 seconds. Then she called Daniel. Meridian is out of Reynolds' contract renewal, she said. I heard, he said. I've also heard from 2 of the firms we spoke to last night. Both want to move forward, and there's a call coming from a company I'd rather tell you about in person because the number involved is significant. How significant? Come to my room, he said. Bring your coffee. She brought her coffee. The number was significant. By Sunday evening, when Emily and Daniel flew back to San Francisco, Clarity Systems had received formal interest from 11 enterprise clients, 5 of whom were currently under contract with Reynolds Technology. 4 journalists had filed requests for interviews. 2 industry analysts had published preliminary assessments of Clarity's architecture based on the technical documentation included in the press release, and both assessments were, in the specific and careful language of people who professionally avoided hyperbole, extraordinary. The word one of them used was unprecedented. Emily read that word in the back of the car on the way from SFO and looked out the window at the city she had made her home and felt something she was still learning to make room for. Pride. Clean, uncomplicated, earned pride. Not the relief kind. Not the I survived kind. The I built something real kind. It felt different from what she'd expected. Quieter. More internal. Less like a vindication and more like an arrival. She had arrived at the thing she had been building toward. Now she had to run it. The Monday morning after the gala, Ethan Reynolds walked into his 42nd floor office in the Reynolds Technology Tower in Seattle and found 3 things waiting for him on his desk. His assistant, who had worked for him for 6 years and who had a very precise internal sensor for the quality of incoming information, delivered them in person rather than by email, which was already a signal. The first thing was the TechCrunch article about Clarity Systems printed out and paperclipped to 2 subsequent pieces that had run over the weekend elaborating on Emily's background and the platform's technical capabilities. The second was a memo from his head of enterprise sales informing him that Meridian Group had declined the contract renewal. The third was a letter from his 3 most senior engineers submitted jointly, which began with the words, "We have accepted offers from Clarity Systems effective the 1st of next month." Ethan sat down. He read all 3 documents twice. Then he called his COO, a man named Richard Park, who had been with Reynolds Technology for 4 years and who Ethan had always valued for his ability to stay calm in complicated situations. "Richard," Ethan said, "my office, now." Richard arrived in 4 minutes. "Tell me what you know," Ethan said. Richard sat down across from him with the careful posture of someone who has been preparing for a difficult conversation. "I know that Clarity's platform solves the integration problem we've been working on for 3 years. I've reviewed their published technical documentation. It's the solution. It's genuinely the solution, and it's implemented cleanly. There's no IP overlap with ours because they built it from a different foundational architecture." He paused. "It's not derivative of our work. It's better than our work." Ethan was quiet. "I also know," Richard continued carefully, "that the founder is Emily Carter." Another silence. "How many people in this building know that?" Ethan said. "By now," Richard said, "most of them. The TechCrunch piece has been circulating since early Saturday. Several people have sent it to the all-hands channel." He paused. "Ethan, the engineering letter. Those 3 people, they were our best technical team. If they go to Clarity, the integration roadmap we announced for Q2. "I know what it means," Ethan said. Richard waited. "What do you recommend?" Ethan said. Richard took a breath. "I think we need to be honest internally before this gets worse. The team knows about Emily's history here. Some of them, the ones who were here during the founding years, they knew even then that her contributions were significant. The public framing of your role as singular founder has always been a tension point for them. Now that Clarity's story is out, that tension is going to surface." Ethan leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You're saying morale is a problem," he said. "I'm saying morale is going to become a crisis if we don't get ahead of it," Richard said. "And I'm saying that the way we get ahead of it is not a PR response. It's a real one." Ethan said nothing. Richard leaned forward. "Ethan, I've worked for you for 4 years. I have been loyal to this company and to you. But I need to ask you directly the story about Clarity's architecture, the way Emily built the predictive integration model. Is that the approach you told me 2 years ago that your team had determined was technically infeasible?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "And who made that determination?" "I did," Ethan said. "I overruled the team recommendation to explore it further." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Did Emily recommend it?" A pause. "Yes," Ethan said. Richard sat back. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say that was a catastrophic decision. He was too professional for either. But his face said both things clearly enough. "What do you need from me?" Richard said. Ethan looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, in longer than he could clearly remember, Ethan Reynolds looked like a man who did not have an answer. "I need time to think," he said. "You have until the board meeting," Richard said. "Thursday." Ethan looked up sharply. "Who called a board meeting?" "3 of the independent directors requested it this morning," Richard said. "Standard protocol given the market movement over the weekend. The stock dropped 4% when trading opened. It'll move more before Thursday if we don't stabilize the narrative." Ethan stared at him. "Thursday," Richard said. "I'm sorry." He left. And Ethan Reynolds sat alone in his 42nd floor office and looked out the window at the Seattle skyline, the same skyline he had looked at for a decade as proof of everything he had built and felt, for the first time, the specific vertigo of a man who has confused the building with the architect. The board meeting was worse than Richard had forecast. Not because the directors were hostile, they were professionals and they kept their language professional, but because the questions they asked required answers that Ethan could not give without either lying or acknowledging truths he had spent 5 years aggressively managing. "The integration roadmap we announced for Q2," said Patricia Holt, the board's lead independent director, a woman in her 60s who had built and sold her own software company and had zero tolerance for imprecision. "Given the departure of the 3 senior engineers and the publication of Clarity's technical documentation, can you tell us honestly whether that timeline is still achievable?" Ethan looked around the table. 8 faces all watching him. "The timeline will need to be reassessed," he said. Patricia wrote something on her notepad. "And the Meridian renewal. Are there other enterprise clients in renewal conversations who might be influenced by Clarity's market entry?" His head of sales, who was also in the room, answered before Ethan could. 4 active renewal conversations have requested a pause pending their review of Clarity's capabilities. 2 others have asked for a competitive assessment. Patricia wrote more notes. "Ethan," she said, not looking up, "the founder of Clarity Systems, Emily Carter, can you tell the board about her role during Reynolds Technologies' founding period?" The room was absolutely still. Ethan looked at Patricia Holt. He looked at the table. He looked at the window behind the board members where the Seattle sky was a flat November gray. He thought about the night at the gala 5 days ago when he had walked up to a stranger and she had turned around and said, "Hello, Ethan." He thought about what she had built. Alone in an apartment in Portland, on a secondhand desk with a laptop and a legal pad, and the knowledge she'd carried out of his life in her head because he hadn't understood what he was throwing away. He thought about Richard's question, did Emily recommend it? Yes. She had recommended it twice. He had dismissed it twice. He had told the board in a strategy presentation 2 years ago that his team had evaluated and rejected the predictive integration approach as technically infeasible. He had let them believe the evaluation was engineering-driven. It had been ego-driven. His ego. His inability to accept that the best idea in the room had come from the person he had already decided to discard. "Emily Carter," he said, and his voice was steady, even though his chest was not served in a senior strategic capacity during Reynolds Technologies' founding and growth period. Her contributions to the company's early architecture and client strategy were significant and have been in retrospect undercharacterized in the company's public history. The room was very quiet. Patricia Holt stopped writing. She looked up at Ethan Reynolds. "Undercharacterized," she repeated. "Yes," he said. Another silence. "Thank you for that," Patricia said. And the way she said it, level careful, carrying the weight of everything that small acknowledgement implied, made clear that the board understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it was going to cost. The weeks after the board meeting moved with the particular speed of institutional crisis, fast enough to feel uncontrollable, slow enough that each development landed with full weight before the next one arrived. The Q2 integration roadmap was formally delayed. The announcement, clinical and strategically worded, landed in the market anyway, with the thud of confirmed weakness. Reynolds Technologies stock, which had already dropped 4%, fell another 7% over the following week. 2 of the 4 enterprise clients who had paused their renewal conversations made their decisions. Both went to Clarity. The engineering talent problem deepened. It wasn't just the 3 who had formally resigned, it was the quiet exodus of mid-level technical staff people who had watched the Clarity story unfold and made private calculations about where the innovation was actually happening and where they wanted to be when the next chapter of enterprise technology was written. Emily hadn't recruited them. She hadn't needed to. The work spoke clearly enough. Daniel brought her the attrition numbers from Reynolds Technologies' public filings on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks after the gala. "I didn't want this," she said, looking at the numbers. He sat across from her. "I know." "I wanted to build something better," she said. "I wanted the market to recognize that there was a better solution. I didn't want his company to collapse." "I know that too," Daniel said. "And for what it's worth, his company isn't collapsing because of you. It's struggling because of decisions he made over a long period of time. You accelerated the exposure of those decisions. You didn't create them." She looked at him. There's a difference, he said. Is there, say? Yes, he said, an important one, and you know it. She did know it, but knowing something and feeling it cleanly are different things, and Emily Carter had always been honest enough with herself to acknowledge the gap between them. She put the numbers aside. What's on the schedule for this afternoon? The Tech Forward interview at 3, Daniel said, and a call with our legal team at 5 regarding the formal inquiry. She looked up. What formal inquiry? Daniel's expression shifted slightly, the particular shift of someone delivering information they have been deciding how to frame. 3 days ago, a former Reynolds Technology Board member filed a request with the SEC for a review of the company's historical filings, specifically the filings that describe the company's founding structure and technical development history. Emily went very still. The request, Daniel said carefully, cites publicly available information about your role at the company and suggests that Reynolds Technology's investor communications may have materially misrepresented the nature of the founding contributions. The silence in the office lasted a full 10 seconds. I didn't file that, Emily said. I know. I didn't authorize anyone to file it. I didn't ask anyone. I know, Daniel said. It was filed independently. Former board member who clearly read the TechCrunch piece and drew their own conclusions. He paused. Emily, you didn't do this, but it's happening, and we need to be prepared for the fact that your name is going to be in the reporting around it. She stood up, walked to the window, looked out at San Francisco for a moment with her hands at her sides. This is bigger than I planned for, she said quietly. Yes, Daniel said. It is. I planned for competition. I planned for market share. I planned for the professional record to be corrected through the quality of the work. She turned back to him. I did not plan for federal inquiry. I know. Ethan, she stopped, started again. Whatever he did, whatever decisions he made, a federal inquiry is... She pressed her lips together. That's a different order of consequence. Daniel looked at her steadily. What do you want to do? She thought about it. She thought about the gala and his face when he recognized her, and the way he'd said, I made a mistake. She thought about what Richard had told someone who had then told someone in Clarity's network that in the board meeting, Ethan had sat in front of his board and said the word undercharacterized and meant it, and it had cost him something visible. She thought about her mother who had said it cuts on its way out, and about the legal pad and the 14 pages and the promise she had made to herself about what this was and what it wasn't. I want to cooperate fully with any inquiry, she said. I want to tell the truth clearly and completely about my role during the founding period of Reynolds Technology. I want the record corrected. She paused. I do not want to pursue punitive action against Ethan personally. If the regulatory process goes where it goes, that's the regulatory process. But I'm not going to become someone who drives that wheel. Daniel nodded once. And the interview this afternoon, she said, I'm going to tell the truth there too, the full truth, professionally framed, legally reviewed, but complete. She looked at him. People deserve to know the real story. All right, he said. I'll have the legal team on standby during the call after. She nodded, picked up her phone, looked at the time. I need 20 minutes before the interview, she said. I'm going to call my mother. Her mother answered on the second ring as she always did. Tell me where you are this week, her mother said. Emily sat down in her chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, felt the weight of everything the last 3 weeks had been the gala, the press release, the calls, the board meeting she'd heard about secondhand, the SEC inquiry. She hadn't anticipated the complicated, unresolved thing in her chest that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between them. I'm in San Francisco, Emily said. I'm about to do the most important interview of my career, and things are bigger than I planned for, and I don't know exactly how this ends. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Do you know who you are? Her mother said. Emily blinked. What? Do you know who you are? Her mother said again. Right now. Do you know? Emily thought about it. Emily thought. She thought about the woman who had stood in the rain outside a Seattle house with one suitcase and no clear future. She thought about the Portland apartment and the 5 a.m. runs and the 30-minute crying sessions and the legal pad and Daniel Cole and the Thursday in San Francisco when he'd written yes on the bottom of her page. She thought about 4.5 years of building something real in the quiet in the dark, without acknowledgement or validation or anyone watching. She thought about walking into a ballroom and being invisible, and she thought about walking out of it as something else entirely. "Yes," she said, "I know who I am." "Then you know how this ends," her mother said. She did. She thanked her mother and hung up, and sat quietly for 10 more minutes, not reviewing her talking points, not preparing her answers, just sitting with the full weight of the story she was about to tell publicly for the first time. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked out of her office to meet the journalist who was going to help her tell it. The Tech Forward interview ran 4,000 words. The headline was, "The Woman Who Actually Built It." It published on a Thursday morning, and by Friday, it had been shared 200,000 times. It told the truth. All of it. Carefully, legally, with precision, and without embellishment, but completely. Emily's contributions to Reynolds Technologies' founding architecture, the strategy memos, the client relationships, the predictive integration framework she had proposed twice and been overruled on twice, and then built alone in a Portland apartment on a second-hand desk. The settlement, the NDA, the legal pad, the promise she'd made to herself, and clarity systems, what it was, what it had built, what it was becoming. The industry read it and went quiet for a moment in the specific way that people go quiet when a truth lands that they had been half knowing for a while and finally have permission to fully acknowledge. Reynolds Technologies stock fell another 11% by end of day Friday. 3 more board members called for a formal leadership review, and Ethan Reynolds, sitting alone in his office on the 42nd floor, read the article from beginning to end without stopping. He read the quote near the end where the journalist had asked Emily if she had anything to say to the people who had underestimated her. She had said, "I don't have anything to say to them. I have something to show them, and I've been showing it for 5 years." He sat with that for a long time. And then he did something that surprised his assistant, who had worked for him for 6 years and thought she knew his patterns well. He closed his office door, turned off his phone, and did not take any calls for the rest of the afternoon. He just sat, with the article, with the truth of it, with the specific, scouring, irreversible weight of understanding, really understanding, maybe, for the first time exactly what he had thrown away, and exactly what it had cost him, and exactly how completely the woman he had underestimated had refused to stay, underestimated. Outside, the city moved, the market moved, the industry moved, everything was moving. And in San Francisco, Emily Carter was already thinking about what came next. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the Tech Forward article had detonated across the industry like a controlled demolition. Emily was in a meeting with her product team when her assistant knocked and opened the door with the specific expression that meant, "This one can't wait." She excused herself, stepped into the hallway, and took the phone. It was Ethan's personal attorney, not his corporate counsel, his personal one. The distinction was important, and she registered it immediately. "Ms. Carter," the attorney said, "my client would like to request a private meeting, not adversarial, not legal in nature. He asked me to use those exact words." Emily leaned against the hallway wall. Through the glass door, she could see her product team waiting, laptops open, coffee going cold. "What does he want to discuss?" she said. "He didn't specify in detail. He asked me to tell you that he's prepared to make a public statement independent of any regulatory proceeding formally acknowledging your foundational contributions to Reynolds Technology. He wants to do it voluntarily, before the SEC inquiry requires it." Emily was quiet for 5 full seconds. "Tell him I'll think about it," she said. She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she went back into the meeting and finished the product review, because the product review mattered, and because Emily Carter did not let personal earthquakes interrupt professional commitments. That discipline had kept her functional through the worst period of her life, and she saw no reason to abandon it now that things were better. But after the team filed out and the room was empty, she sat alone at the conference table and let herself feel the full strangeness of what had just happened. Ethan Reynolds was going to tell the truth, voluntarily. She had not asked for it. She had not demanded it as a condition of anything. She had done the interview, told her story, let the work speak, and somewhere in the rubble of the consequences, the man who had erased her had decided on his own, without legal compulsion, without her forcing his hand, that the erasure needed to be undone. She didn't know what to do with that. She called Daniel. "He wants to meet," she said without preamble. A pause. "Ethan." His attorney called. "He wants to make a voluntary public statement about my role at Reynolds Technology, before the SEC process requires it." Another pause longer. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "which is unusual for me." "Do you want my opinion? That's why I'm calling you." "Meet with him," Daniel said. "Not because he deserves it. Because you've spent 5 years building something that's bigger than both of you and carrying unresolved history with the person who's most connected to your origin story is a weight that will slow you down eventually, even if you don't feel it yet." He paused. "Also, and I say this as someone who has watched you operate for 5 years and has enormous respect for your judgment, I think part of you wants to meet with him. And I think that's okay." She was quiet. "It's okay to want resolution," Daniel said. "That's not weakness, that's human." She stared at the ceiling of the empty conference room. "Schedule it," she said. "Neutral location, my terms on time and duration, and Daniel, you're going alone," he said. "I know." She almost smiled. "How did you know?" "Because you've been doing the hard things alone your whole life," he said. "This one you'll want to do the same way." She met Ethan Reynolds on a Thursday afternoon at a hotel in San Francisco. Not her city, not his city, in the sense that mattered. A neutral city. A quiet corner of the lobby restaurant before the lunch crowd when the room was mostly empty and the noise level was low enough that a conversation could be private without feeling staged. She arrived first. She always arrived first. It was a habit so old she no longer thought about it arriving early to any significant meeting, taking the time alone to settle her own internal state before anyone else walked in. She ordered water. She sat with her hands folded on the table. She breathed. He walked in at exactly the agreed time, which she noted, because punctuality was not something she associated with the Ethan Reynolds she had known at his most powerful. He looked different. Not dramatically, he was still dressed well, still carried himself with the residual posture of a man accustomed to being significant. But something had been taken out from behind his eyes, some particular quality of certainty that had, in the years when it was at its worst, shaded into arrogance. He sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You're welcome," she said. Another silence. She let it sit. She had learned in 5 years of high-stakes negotiations and board presentations and client conversations that the person who rushes to fill the silence is usually the person with more to prove. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for weeks," Ethan said. "My attorney kept telling me to wait until the legal situation clarified. I kept feeling like waiting was wrong." He looked at the table. "So I stopped waiting." "All right," she said. He looked up. "The statement I want to make, the public one, I want to go further than what my attorney outlined. I don't want to just acknowledge your contributions in general terms. I want to be specific. The integration architecture, the early client strategy, the founding decisions that the company's public history attributed to me that were actually—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "That were actually yours." Emily looked at him steadily. "Ethan, why now the SEC inquiry hasn't required anything from you yet? The legal pressure is still early. You didn't have to—" "Because I read the article," he said. "The tech-forward piece. I read it start to finish alone in my office and—" He stopped again. He pressed his hand flat on the table, a gesture she recognized from 12 years of watching him think through things that were harder than he wanted them to be. "I've been telling myself a story for 5 years, about what happened between us. About the company, about my role, and reading your words, not accusations. Just facts, just what actually happened." In your voice, I couldn't hold the story anymore. She was very still. "I knew what I was doing," he said. "When I negotiated the settlement the way I did, when I let the public narrative develop the way it did, I told myself it was business, that our personal relationship and the professional record were separate things, and I had a right to protect the company's image." He looked at her. I knew that was a lie when I was telling it. I just told it anyway. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Heavier, cleaner somehow, the specific quality of silence that arrives when something true has been said out loud for the first time. Emily looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. I'm sorry, he said. And then, because that felt insufficient, he said it again. I'm sorry, Emily, for all of it. She sat with that. There is a thing that happens when you have spent years preparing for a moment, and the moment arrives differently than you prepared for. Not worse, not better, just different. More human, less dramatic. Just two people in a quiet restaurant telling each other the truth after a very long time of not doing that. She had planned for this possibility. She had thought through what she would say, how she would hold the line, how she would receive an apology if one came, what conditions she would set, what she would not give away. What she hadn't planned for was how ordinary it would feel, how much smaller in person the massive architecture of her anger had become. Not gone. She wasn't going to pretend it was gone, but smaller, human-sized. I accept that, she said finally. He looked at her. That's not the same as saying everything is fine, she said. It's not. What you did had real consequences for real years of my life. I lost time I won't get back. I lost a version of the future I thought I was building. She held his gaze. But I also built something else, something better, honestly. And I can't hold on to the damage and also fully inhabit what I've built, so... She paused. I accept it. He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had been bracing for something harder and was not entirely sure how to receive something more complete. The statement, she said, returning to business, because business was where she was most comfortable, and because some things once said don't need to be extended. I want to review it before you release it, not to approve or censor to ensure accuracy. The facts need to be right. Of course, he said. And I want a version that acknowledges Daniel's role in building clarity, she said. This isn't only my story. He believed in what I was building when he had no obligation to. That deserves to be part of the record. Ethan nodded again. I'll have my team send you the draft. Good. She picked up her water. He ordered coffee. And then, in the strange aftermath of everything that had just been said, they sat in a somewhat ordinary silence that felt not comfortable exactly, but no longer weighted with 5 years of unresolved history. How's your mother? Ethan said after a while. Emily looked at him. The question surprised her. She had not expected him to ask about her mother. She's well, she said. She asks about the company. She tracks our press coverage. She sends me articles about clarity systems that I've already read. She paused. She sent me the Tech Forward piece with a note that said, "This is exactly right." Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. Almost. She always knew what you were worth, before I did. She always knew what I was worth, Emily agreed, before I fully did too. He looked at her. Do you now? She met his eyes. Yes, she said. I do. They shook hands when they left. Not warmly, not coldly. The handshake of two people who have been through something significant together and have arrived finally at something that resembles peace without being able to call it that yet. She walked out of the hotel and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November air. She wasn't sure what she felt. She called Daniel from the car. How was it? He said. Honest, she said, from both sides. Are you okay? She thought about it with the same real consideration she'd given the question when he'd asked it the night of the gala. I think I'm better than okay, she said. I think I'm done with that part. She watched the city move past the window. It's a strange feeling. I've been carrying the weight of what happened for 5 years. I built with it. I used it. And now I think I'm ready to put it down. That sounds healthy, Daniel said carefully. Don't make it weird, she said. He laughed. A real one. The NBC interview request is in your inbox, he said. They want a full hour, prime time. The segment producer is describing it as a conversation about reinvention and resilience. Their target audience is women over 40. She looked out the window. Women over 40. Women who had started over. Women who had been told their contributions didn't count. Their intelligence was inconvenient. Their presence was dispensable. Women who had stood in the rain with a suitcase and made themselves a promise. Tell them yes, she said. But I want approval on the framing. Not editorial control, just a conversation about how they're positioning it before I agree to the format. Already drafted the response, Daniel said. Of course you did. We're a good team, he said simply. We're a great team, she corrected. The NBC interview aired on a Wednesday evening in February, 7 months after the Apex Technology Gala. 42 million people watched it live. Another 20 million streamed it within the first 72 hours. It became the most watched primetime interview of the television quarter, which nobody in Emily's team had expected, including Emily, who had thought she had a reasonably accurate model of the likely viewership. She had been wrong, in the best possible direction. She sat across from the interviewer, a woman named Carol Marsh, who had been conducting significant interviews for 30 years and who asked questions with the particular precision of someone who does not believe in letting her subjects perform, and she told her story. Not the corporate version, not the press release version, the real one. The rain, the suitcase, the Portland apartment, the legal pad, the 30-minute crying sessions and the 5 a.m. runs and the second-hand desk and the 14 pages of what she actually knew and the promise she had made to herself about what this was going to be. Daniel, the Thursday in San Francisco when he'd written yes on the bottom of her page. 4.5 years of building in the dark. And then the gala, the ballroom, the moment Ethan looked at her face and didn't recognize it. She told it plainly, without drama, without editorializing, without asking the audience to feel anything specific. She just told the truth and let the truth do what truth does when it's given enough room. Carol Marsh was quiet for a moment after Emily finished. Then she said, "When you walked into that ballroom and he didn't recognize you, what were you feeling in that moment?" Emily thought about it. "Sad," she said. "I was sad. Not for myself, I was past that. Sad for the version of our marriage where that was possible. Sad that 12 years of sharing a life with someone could result in him looking at my face and seeing a stranger." She paused. "And then, almost immediately after the sadness, I felt something else." "What?" "Clear," Emily said. "I felt clear, like a question I had been carrying for 5 years was finally answered." "What question?" "Whether I had ever been fully seen," she said, "by him." The answer was no, and knowing that clearly, finally, without room for doubt, was the thing that let me completely let go. Carol Marsh looked at her for a moment. "You said earlier that revenge was never the goal," she said. "I want to ask you about that directly because a lot of people watching tonight have been in situations where they were underestimated, where something was taken from them, and they're going to want to know if it wasn't revenge. What was it?" Emily looked at the interviewer. Then she looked briefly at somewhere beyond the interviewer, at something that wasn't in the studio at all, that was back in a Portland apartment with a legal pad and a single lamp and a woman who had just stopped crying and started planning. "It was reclamation," she said. "I wasn't trying to punish him. I was trying to take back the parts of myself that I had allowed to be minimized. The intelligence, the capability, the voice, I had let those things be made smaller in service of someone else's narrative. And I wanted them back." She paused. "The best thing I ever did was stop trying to prove anything to him and start building something for myself. Because the moment you stop building your life as a response to someone else's actions, that's when you actually become free." The response to the interview was not something Emily could have accurately modeled in advance. Her inbox received 11,000 emails in the first 24 hours. Her assistant printed a representative sample and brought them to her in a folder 3 inches thick front and back. Letters from women in their 50s who had left marriages after decades and were rebuilding careers. Letters from women in their 30s who were in the middle of the leaving and hadn't yet found the ground underneath them. Letters from women in their 60s who had never told anyone what had been taken from them and were writing to Emily because writing to Emily felt like the first step toward telling someone. She read every letter her assistant printed. It took 4 evenings. She cried during the second evening, which she had not expected. Not the 30-minute controlled kind. The quiet, surprised kind that arrives when you realize your private story has landed inside someone else's private story and given them something they needed. She called her mother after the second evening of reading. "Tell me where you are this week," her mother said. "I'm home," Emily said. And she meant it in every sense of the word, the San Francisco apartment that had become genuinely hers, the company that was genuinely hers, the life that was genuinely hers. "I'm home, Mom. I think I'm finally home." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "I know," her mother said. "I've known for a while. I was waiting for you to know." The Ethan Reynolds public statement came out the following week. It was 3 paragraphs long. It was specific. It named Emily by name, described her architectural contributions to Reynolds Technologies' founding platform, acknowledged that the company's public-facing history had failed to accurately represent her role, and stated clearly that the predictive integration framework at the core of Clarity Systems, the innovation that was now reshaping the enterprise technology market, had originated with Emily Carter. It did not say "I'm sorry." That had been said privately in a quiet corner of a San Francisco restaurant, and Emily had decided that was where it belonged. What it said, in the carefully measured language of a public record, was the truth. The industry response was swift. Several journalists published pieces revisiting the Reynolds Technology founding story. 2 business school professors contacted Emily's team, requesting permission to use Clarity's development history as a case study in entrepreneurship and resilience courses. A major women's business organization announced it was creating an award in Emily's name for entrepreneurs who had rebuilt careers after significant professional setbacks. She declined the award. She called the organization's director directly and said, "I'm honored, genuinely, but I'd rather you use the platform to spotlight women who are currently in the middle of the rebuilding, not on the other side of it. The women who need to see themselves reflected in your work are the ones who are still in the Portland apartment, not the ones who've already gotten out." The director was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a better program," she said. "I know," Emily said. "Let's build it together." Reynolds Technologies' leadership review concluded in March. Ethan stepped down as CEO. He did not fight it publicly, did not issue a combative statement, did not attempt to spin the departure as voluntary in a way that would insult anyone's intelligence. He simply stepped back. The board appointed an interim CEO and announced a strategic review. Emily heard about it through Daniel, who had heard through a board contact. She was in the middle of reviewing Clarity's Q1 projections when the message came in. She read it, set her phone down, went back to the projections. Priya, who was sitting across from her, looked up. "You okay?" "Yes," Emily said. "You just went very still for about 30 seconds. "Ethan stepped down," Emily said simply. Priya was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Emily looked at the projections on her laptop, the numbers that represented 4.5 years of building in the dark, now illuminated and expanding faster than even her aggressive modeling had projected. "I feel like there's a lot of work to do," she said, "and like I'm exactly the right person to do it." Priya nodded. "That's a good answer." "It's the true one," Emily said, and went back to the projections. What came next in the months that followed was not a dramatic second act. It was something better than that. It was the ordinary, extraordinary rhythm of a life being fully lived. Clarity. Systems closed its Series B round in April, significantly oversubscribed at a valuation that put them firmly in the conversation with the largest enterprise technology firms in the market. Emily rang the closing with Daniel and their core team in the San Francisco office with sparkling water because that's what she'd always preferred, and she was done pretending otherwise. She hired Priya as Chief Operating Officer, which surprised no one who had watched them work together. She hired 3 of the engineers who had left Reynolds Technology not as a strategic acquisition, but because they were excellent, and because they asked, and because she evaluated each of them on their merits, the way she evaluated everything. She expanded the client base to 22 enterprise accounts across 4 industries. She launched a mentorship program for women in technology leadership structured specifically around the skills she had found most valuable during her own rebuilding financial literacy, strategic communication, and the particular courage required to claim credit for your own work. She moved into a new apartment larger with real light, with a view of something other than a parking garage. She furnished it slowly and intentionally, the way she did everything, choosing things she actually loved rather than things that were adequate. And on a Saturday morning in May, she was sitting on the balcony of that apartment with her coffee and her phone and the comfortable quiet of a morning with nowhere she had to be for 3 hours when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. She opened it. It was from Chloe Bennett. Emily stared at the name for a moment. Chloe Bennett, 24-year-old social media influencer, 300,000 Instagram followers, the beautiful young woman who had been on Ethan's arm the night Emily found the restaurant charge in the expense reports. The woman Emily had thought about in the early Portland months with a complicated mixture of feelings she had worked hard to untangle. The message was 3 sentences. I know you have no reason to respond to this. I watched your NBC interview 4 times. I just wanted to say that I was young and I didn't understand what I was part of and I'm sorry. Emily read it 3 times. Then she put her phone face down on the balcony table and picked up her coffee and looked out at the city for a while. She thought about the word young. She thought about what it meant to be 24 and beautiful and sought after by a powerful, charming man who made you feel chosen. She thought about how little Chloe could have understood at that age about what she was walking into. She thought about the ways women were positioned against each other by the choices of men who benefited from the positioning. She picked up her phone. She typed, "You were young. I understand. Thank you for saying this." She sent it. Then she put the phone down and went back to her coffee. That was all it needed to be. Daniel called later that afternoon. He called most Saturday afternoons, not about work, just the comfortable check-in of 2 people who had built something real together and had developed along the way a friendship that neither of them had specifically planned for, but both of them valued enormously. "The Forbes piece is coming out Monday," he said. "They sent the final draft for fact check. You're on the cover." She had known the cover was coming. She had approved the photo. She had reviewed the article. But hearing it said out loud simply on a Saturday afternoon Forbes cover Monday produced a feeling she hadn't fully anticipated. Not pride. Something quieter. Something that had to do with a 24-year-old woman who had moved to Seattle with $400 and a head full of ideas and had spent a very long time pouring those ideas into someone else's story, and a 37-year-old woman who had finally written her own. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. "What are you doing this afternoon?" "I was going to go for a run," she said. 5 a.m. habits die hard. "This one I'm keeping," she said. "It works." She ran 6 miles that afternoon through the city she had made her home. Not at 5 in the morning, not in the dark, not to outrun anything. Just in the ordinary afternoon light, moving through streets she knew in a body she had rebuilt in a life she had constructed, piece by careful piece, from the wreckage of a different one. She ran past a bookstore and through a neighborhood where someone was grilling, and the smell was good, and under a bridge where pigeons gathered, and along a stretch of waterfront where the bay was silver and cold. She thought about her mother who was planning to visit in June and who would sit at Emily's kitchen table and drink coffee and say, "Tell me where you are this week," and Emily would be able to say, "Here, right here, all the way here." She thought about the women who had written to her, the ones in the middle of the rebuilding, the ones in the Portland apartment, and about the mentorship program and what it might become and what it might give them that someone had not been there to give her. She thought about Daniel and equal partnership and what it meant to build something with someone who respected what you brought to the room. She thought about the legal pad with 14 pages. She thought about the 30-minute timer. She thought about the second-hand desk and the parking garage view and the 5 a.m. darkness and the specific clarifying moment when she had looked at herself in a mirror and not recognized the woman looking back in the good way, in the possible way. She ran. And when she got home, she stood in her apartment hers, with the real light and the real view and the life she had actually chosen. And she caught her breath. She was 37 years old. She was the founder and CEO of a company that was rewriting the rules of her industry. She was the woman on the Forbes cover. She was the woman 400 letters had been written to by women who recognized themselves in her story. She was the daughter of an Ohio woman who had worked double shifts and sent her daughter to college on tips, and had always known before anyone else did exactly what she was worth. She was the woman who had stood in the rain with one suitcase and made herself a promise, and she had kept it. Completely, without compromise, without bitterness, without becoming someone she didn't recognize in service of making someone else pay. She had simply built. She had built and built and built with every tool she had. Every morning she could get herself out of bed every hour. She could keep her hands moving toward the things she knew she was capable of, until what she had built was so real and so undeniable and so completely hers that the world had no choice but to look at it and say yes. This is true. This is who she is. This is what she made. The best revenge is not destruction. The best revenge is not even success exactly, though success is part of it. The best revenge is becoming so thoroughly, completely, undeniably yourself, so fully arrived at the life your pain tried to prevent, that the person who underestimated you becomes a footnote in the story of who you decided to be. Emily Carter had been thrown away by a man who thought she was disposable. She had turned out to be the one thing he could not afford to lose. And she had made something out of that truth that would outlast all of them. The gala, the interview, the cover, the apology, every article and award and client contract and letter from a stranger who recognized herself in Emily's story. She had made a life, fully, finally, and on no one's terms but her own.